My daughter tried to sell my mother's Holocaust survival ring to pay for a vacation to Paris. That phone call from the jeweler saved more than just a family heirloom, revealed exactly who my child had become. My name is Virginia Brennan, and I'm 73 years old. I spent 50 years as a certified public accountant, building a consulting firm from nothing, analyzing fraud cases, protecting clients' assets. I thought I understood betrayal in all its financial forms. Balance sheets don't lie, numbers tell the truth. But I never learned to read the calculations happening in my own daughter's heart. That diamond ring sitting in my safe wasn't just jewelry. When my mother pressed it into my hands in 1998, 3 days before cancer took her, she told me it was the only thing she carried out of Poland in 1944, sewn into her coat lining as she ran from everything she'd ever known. That ring represented survival itself. I kept it untouched for 27 years, waiting for Amanda's wedding day to pass it down. She grew up hearing those stories, or so I thought. The call came on a Tuesday morning from Morrison & Sons, the jeweler where my late husband Thomas bought every piece of jewelry he ever gave me over 41 years of marriage. Mr. Morrison's voice was careful, concerned. He told me my daughter had brought in a vintage diamond ring for consignment sale. He recognized the distinctive 1920s European cut immediately, seen photos when Thomas showed them off years ago. He thought I should know before processing any transaction. My hands went cold holding that phone. My heart, which survived 73 years, a mild cardiac event in 2019, and losing Thomas in 2021, started racing like I was 20 again. This is the story of how I discovered my daughter valued a European vacation over 3 generations of survival, and how I made sure she'd never forget the true cost of that choice. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you everything that happened, because the details matter. In accounting, we call it the paper trail. In family, we call it the truth. Subscribe and stay with me, because what started with one phone call ended with my daughter learning the hardest lesson of her life, and it cost her exactly $1.7 million to understand it. The moment I hung up with Mr. Morrison, I sat in my home office, the same room where I'd managed million-dollar accounts, caught embezzlement schemes, built a business, and felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I'd raised Amanda in this house. Every corner held memories. The kitchen where I taught her to bake my mother's Polish apple cake. The living room where Thomas and I helped her with calculus homework, where we celebrated her college acceptance, her first real job, her promotion to marketing director. The garden where she used to chase butterflies as a little girl, before smartphones and European vacation dreams. I picked up my phone and called her directly. No hesitation, no preparation. After 5 decades investigating financial discrepancies, I knew the first rule: get their story before they have time to craft a better one. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. She asked how I was feeling, mentioned the weather, talked about some campaign she was running at work. Normal daughter conversation. Nothing in her tone suggested she'd just tried to liquidate my most precious possession. I cut through the pleasantries. I told her Mr. Morrison had called about a ring. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but I've taken enough depositions to know that silence is confession. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. No more brightness. Just defensive justification. She told me I never wore that ring anyway, that it just sat in my safe collecting dust. She and her boyfriend Jake needed the money for their trip to Paris. They'd already booked the flights, the hotel, everything. She said I had so many pieces of jewelry, would I really miss one ring? She actually used those words, would you really miss it? I looked at my hands while she talked, hands that had typed countless financial reports, signed business contracts, held my dying mother's fingers, wore my wedding band for 4 decades until Thomas passed. These hands had built something from nothing. My mother's hands had clutched that ring while running from Nazi-occupied Poland at 19 years old. I asked Amanda if she remembered the stories about her grandmother, the ones I'd told her every year on the anniversary of my mother's death. The stories about the coat with the secret lining, about crossing borders in the middle of the night, about arriving in America with nothing but that ring and enormous courage. Amanda said of course she remembered, but that was a long time ago, and I was being dramatic. She said the ring was just sitting there, not helping anyone. At least this way it would create memories. She'd think of Grandma Rose every time she looked at photos from Paris. That's when I understood. My daughter hadn't forgotten the stories. She'd simply decided they didn't matter as much as her vacation. I told her I needed to go and ended the call. My hands were shaking. Not from age or medication or my cardiac condition, from rage that came from somewhere deep and old, from the part of me that was still Rose Kaminsky's daughter, still the child of a woman who'd survived the unspeakable. I called for a taxi. At 73 I still drive, but I didn't trust myself behind the wheel. 20 minutes later, I walked into Morrison & Sons, the same jewelry store where Thomas had nervously bought my engagement ring in 1972, where he'd surprised me with pearl earrings for our 20th anniversary, where Mr. Morrison had quietly helped him select pieces over decades of marriage. Mr. Morrison saw me coming and met me at the door. His face held the kind of careful concern people use with the elderly when they're not sure how much upset we can handle. He led me to his private office in the back, the one reserved for estate appraisals and difficult conversations. The ring sat on black velvet on his desk. I hadn't seen it in person for 6 months. I checked on it periodically, but rarely removed it from the safe. The diamond caught the office light exactly the way I remembered, that distinctive old European cut, slightly imperfect by modern standards, absolutely perfect in every way that mattered. Mr. Morrison explained that Amanda had come in 3 days earlier. She'd presented proper identification, claimed full ownership, signed all the consignment paperwork. Everything appeared legitimate on the surface. But he'd recognized the ring immediately, remembered the stories Thomas had shared, and something felt wrong. He'd stalled the process, told Amanda he needed a few days for proper appraisal, then called me. I asked him about the paperwork. He showed me Amanda's signature, her confident handwriting on the consignment agreement. The estimated sale price, $45,000. The ring would have been listed in their estate jewelry collection, probably sold within a month to some collector who'd never know its real value. $45,000. That's what my daughter thought 3 generations of survival were worth. Less than the down payment on her car. Less than 1 year of her boyfriend's salary. Enough to fund a luxury vacation with first-class flights and 5-star hotels, but not enough to honor the woman who made her existence possible. Mr. Morrison asked what I wanted to do. I told him to keep the ring safe, that I'd handle the legal aspects. He nodded, placed the ring in his personal safe, and handed me a receipt. Then, he did something unexpected. This man who'd known my family for 40 years, who'd sold Thomas jewelry for every major milestone, looked at me with genuine sadness and said my daughter had seemed excited about the sale, had shown him pictures of Paris on her phone, had mentioned how the money would make their trip perfect. I thanked him and left. Outside on the sidewalk, I stood in the afternoon sun of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday and felt the world tilt slightly. Cars passed, people walked by with coffee cups and shopping bags. Normal life continuing while mine rearranged itself into something different. I thought about calling Amanda back, demanding explanations, screaming about betrayal and disrespect. But 50 years of business taught me something valuable. Emotion is expensive. Anger clouds judgment. The best revenge isn't loud, it's precise. Instead, I took another taxi home, went straight to my office, and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. David Chen, my estate attorney since 2010, the man who'd helped me structure my assets after Thomas died, who'd set up trusts and wills and all the careful architecture of leaving something behind. I sent him a text message, something I'd only recently learned to do. David, I need to revise my will immediately. Can you come to the house tomorrow morning? His response came within minutes. He could be there at 9. I sat at my desk as evening shadows filled the room, looking at the family photos on the walls. Amanda at 5, gap-toothed and giggling. Amanda at 16, rolling her eyes at some dad joke. Amanda at 23, graduating college, hugging me tight. Amanda at 35, just last Christmas, raising a wine glass in my dining room, promising we'd always be close. Promises are like contracts. They mean nothing if one party decides to breach them. My phone buzzed. A text from Amanda. Mom, can we talk about this? I think you're overreacting. I stared at that message for a long time. Overreacting, that word people use when they want you to accept their bad behavior quietly, when they want you to be reasonable about their unreasonableness. I typed back one sentence. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., my office. Come alone. Then I turned off my phone and sat in the growing darkness, feeling something shift and harden inside me. They say you never really know someone until money's involved. I was about to teach my daughter exactly how well I knew her. David Chen arrived at 9 sharp the next morning, briefcase in hand, wearing the same serious expression he'd worn when we restructured my estate after Thomas died. I'd made coffee, good coffee, the expensive kind I save for important occasions, and we sat in my office with the door closed. I told him everything. The ring, the history, Amanda's attempt to sell it, Mr. Morrison's intervention. David listened without interrupting, taking notes in his precise handwriting. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me with the careful directness of someone who's about to say something I might not want to hear. He explained that technically, what Amanda had done could be considered attempted theft of family property. The ring was documented in my estate inventory, clearly listed as my personal asset, but he also warned me that pursuing legal action against my own daughter would be painful, public, and potentially permanent. Family court battles leave scars that never fully heal. I told him I wasn't interested in criminal charges. I wanted something else entirely. I wanted to protect what I'd built from someone who'd just proven she didn't value it. I wanted to make sure this never happened again. And I wanted Amanda to understand, really understand, what she'd tried to throw away. David nodded slowly. He asked if I was certain, reminded me that estate decisions made in anger often lead to regret. I appreciated his caution. That's why I'd hired him in the first place. But this wasn't anger. This was clarity. The kind that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are, and you finally believe them. We spent 2 hours going through my complete estate documentation, everything I'd accumulated over 73 years of life, 50 years of work, 41 years of marriage, the house in Westwood, purchased in 1981 for $180,000, now worth $850,000, the portfolio of stocks and bonds, carefully grown through decades of smart investing, the consulting firm I'd sold in 2015, which still generated annual royalties, the savings accounts, the IRAs, the life insurance policies. David had the numbers memorized. Total estate value, approximately $1.9 million. Amanda was my only child, my sole heir. Under my current will, everything would go to her when I died. Every penny, every asset, every piece of jewelry, including the ring she'd just tried to convert into a Paris vacation. I asked David to draft a new will. He pulled out his laptop and started typing as I spoke. I wanted 80% of my estate, roughly $1.5 million, donated to specific organizations: the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, the International Rescue Committee, local refugee resettlement programs, organizations that helped people who'd lost everything rebuild their lives, just like my mother had done in 1944. The remaining 20%, approximately $380,000, would go to Amanda. Nothing. I wasn't cruel, but not everything she'd been counting on either. David stopped typing and looked at me. He asked if I was sure about this distribution. Once signed, notarized, and filed, it would be extremely difficult to change. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. He saved the document and promised to have it ready for my signature by Friday. Then he asked about the immediate situation, the meeting with Amanda I'd scheduled for that afternoon. I told him I wanted documentation of the complete estate, printed and organized. I wanted her to see exactly what she'd risked for a vacation. David understood immediately. He'd been handling estates for 30 years. He knew how money reveals character. Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said something I appreciated. He told me I was stronger than most people he knew, and that strength didn't make this hurt any less. He was right on both counts. After David left, I had 5 hours before Amanda arrived. I spent them doing something I hadn't done in years. I went through every piece of jewelry I owned, every photograph, every document that connected me to my mother. In my bedroom closet, behind winter coats and old shoe boxes, I found the small leather trunk I'd kept since 1998. Inside were my mother's things, not many. She'd never accumulated much. A woman who'd fled with nothing, learned to travel light through life, but there were letters. Dozens of letters my mother had written to relatives over the years, some in Polish, some in broken English, photographs from before the war, my mother at 18, smiling in a summer dress, standing outside a building I'd never see because it was probably destroyed 70 years ago. A birth certificate, yellowed and fragile. A naturalization certificate from 1952. when Rose Kaminsky officially became Rose Kaminsky Bennett, American citizen. And there, wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom, I found something I'd forgotten, a small journal my mother had kept during her first years in America. Her English was rough, full of mistakes, but the meaning was clear. She'd written about working in a garment factory, saving every penny, slowly building a life from nothing. One entry from 1954 stopped me cold. She'd written about the ring, about how she'd been tempted to sell it dozens of times when money was tight, when she couldn't afford rent or food or winter clothes, but she'd kept it because it represented something bigger than money. It represented the fact that she'd survived when so many hadn't, that she'd made it to America when millions died trying, that her future daughter me would exist because she'd refused to give up. I sat on my bedroom floor at 73 years old, reading my dead mother's words, and something crystallized. Amanda hadn't just tried to sell a ring, she'd tried to erase the meaning of survival itself. She'd reduced my mother's courage to $45,000 and a vacation itinerary. I spent the next hour photographing pages from that journal. I documented everything. Then, I returned to my office and created a simple folder, Family History. Inside, I placed copies of my mother's naturalization papers, selected journal entries, photographs from Poland, and a detailed written history of the ring that I typed out myself, dates and facts and stories all carefully recorded. At 1:30 p.m., I arranged everything on my desk, not the cozy sitting area where Amanda and I usually talked over tea and cookies, my formal desk, the one I'd used for business negotiations, the one that meant serious conversation. I placed the estate documentation David had prepared on the left side, the family history folder on the right, and in the center, in a small velvet box Mr. Morrison had given me, I placed my mother's ring. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m. Amanda was always punctual. I'd raised her that way. I opened the door to find my daughter looking nervous but defiant. She was dressed casual jeans and a nice sweater, but she'd made an effort, makeup carefully applied, hair styled. She was preparing for negotiation, trying to look put together and reasonable. She stepped inside and immediately started talking. She told me she'd been thinking about what happened, that maybe she should have asked first, that she didn't realize I'd be this upset. Notice what she didn't say. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say she'd been wrong. I led her to my office without responding. She saw the setup immediately, the formal arrangement, the documents, the jewelry box. Her expression shifted from nervous to wary. I gestured for her to sit in the chair across from my desk, the client chair. She sat slowly, her eyes moving from one stack of papers to another, trying to assess the situation. I sat down in my chair, the position I'd occupied for 50 years while running a business, managing accounts, making decisions that affected people's financial futures. I folded my hands on the desk and looked at my daughter, really looked at her maybe for the first time in years. She was 37 years old, beautiful, educated, successful in her career. I'd given her every advantage: private school, college with no student loans, a down payment on her first apartment, connections that helped launch her marketing career. I'd been a good mother, maybe too good. I opened the family history folder and pushed it across the desk. I told her to read it, all of it. Amanda hesitated, then picked up the first document. I watched her face as she read my mother's journal entries, studied the photographs, looked at the naturalization papers. It took 20 minutes. I didn't speak. I let the documents tell the story I'd apparently failed to make real for her. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully. She started to say something about understanding the ring's sentimental value, about how she'd just thought. I held up one hand. I wasn't finished. I opened the estate documentation and slid it across the desk. I explained what she was looking at, a complete inventory of everything I owned, everything I'd built, everything she'd been assuming would eventually be hers. I watched her eyes widen as she processed the numbers, the house, the investments, the full scope of $1.9 million in assets. I'd never discussed my complete finances with her before. Children don't need to know what they'll inherit. It makes them count on money they haven't earned. But now she needed to know, because I was about to tell her how much of it she'd just lost. Amanda's hands trembled slightly as she held the estate inventory. I'd seen that reaction before, back in my accounting days when clients finally understood the full scope of their financial situation, numbers on paper becoming real, abstract wealth transforming into concrete loss. She looked up at me with an expression I recognized from her childhood, the look she'd worn when caught in a lie about broken dishes or missed curfews, half defiant, half hoping I'd let it slide like I always had, expecting forgiveness because I was her mother, and that's what mothers do. I let the silence stretch. Another business tactic I'd learned decades ago. People will fill silence with truth if you just wait long enough. Finally, she spoke. She told me she hadn't realized the ring meant this much to me, that if she'd known I'd react this way, she never would have taken it to the jeweler. Still phrasing it as my overreaction, not her betrayal. Still making this about my feelings instead of her actions. I opened the velvet box and turned it so she could see the ring. The diamond caught the afternoon light streaming through my office window, the same light that had illuminated this room through 50 years of business decisions, through late nights calculating tax returns, through the morning I sat here crying after Thomas died. I asked her a simple question. Did she remember what I'd told her this ring represented? She nodded quickly, eager to show she understood. She said it was Grandma Rose's ring from Poland, that it was old and valuable, that it had family history. She was reciting facts like a student who'd memorized information without understanding meaning. I picked up one of the journal pages from my mother's folder, the entry from 1954 where she'd written about almost selling the ring but choosing survival's meaning over survival's price. I read it aloud to Amanda in my mother's broken English, every grammatical error preserved, every misspelled word intact. My mother's voice, speaking across decades, telling her granddaughter something important. When I finished reading, I set the page down and told Amanda the part of the story I'd never shared before. The part my mother told me privately, the week before she died. In 1962, when I was 10 years old, my mother had taken the ring to a jeweler, ironically the same Morrison and Sons, though it was old Mr. Morrison back then. My father had lost his job at the factory. We were 3 months behind on rent. The electric company had sent a final notice. My mother stood at that counter with the ring in her hand, ready to trade survival for survival. Old Mr. Morrison had looked at the ring, looked at my mother, and told her something she never forgot. He said some things were worth more than their monetary value, and that selling pieces of your soul to solve temporary problems left permanent holes. Then he'd loaned her $500 a fortune in 1962 at 0 interest, to be repaid whenever she could manage it. She paid him back over 3 years, $20 at a time. My mother never told me this story while my father was alive, only at the end, when she wanted me to understand why she'd kept the ring through every financial hardship, every moment of desperation. She'd said that Mr. Morrison taught her the difference between price and value, and she'd spent the rest of her life learning that lesson deeper. Amanda listened to this story with tears forming in her eyes. She reached across the desk as if to touch my hand, told me she understood now, that she was sorry, that she'd made a terrible mistake. Her voice broke on the word sorry, and for a moment I almost softened. Almost then she said something that revealed everything I needed to know about who my daughter had become. She said we could forget this whole thing happened, that she'd cancel the Paris trip, that maybe next year when things were better financially she could plan something smaller. She said she loved me and would never hurt me like this again. And then she asked if we could put this behind us and go back to normal. Put it behind us. Go back to normal. As if the past 3 days had been a simple misunderstanding, a minor family squabble over a miscommunication. As if trust, once shattered, could be swept up and glued back together with apologies and promises. I looked at my daughter across the desk and saw her clearly for perhaps the first time. She wasn't sorry she'd tried to sell the ring. She was sorry she'd been caught. She wasn't devastated by the betrayal. She was worried about the consequences. This wasn't the remorse of someone who understood what they'd done wrong. This was the performance of someone trying to minimize damage. I pulled the estate documents back toward me and tapped the total figure at the bottom. I asked her if she saw this number. She nodded, confused about the change in direction. I told her this represented 3 generations of work. My mother's factory wages, saved penny by penny. My career as an accountant, building from nothing to a successful consulting firm. My marriage to Thomas, our combined efforts to create security for our family. This wasn't just my money, it was legacy money, survival money, future money. Then I pulled out a second document from my desk drawer, the one David Chen had prepared that morning in preliminary form. The new will, not signed yet, but drafted, reviewed, ready for execution. I slid it across the desk and told her to read page 3, section 5. The distribution of assets. I watched the color drain from Amanda's face as she processed what she was reading. 80% to charitable organizations focused on refugee assistance and Holocaust remembrance. 20% $380,000 to her. She looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in my daughter's eyes before. Not remorse, not understanding, but calculation. She was doing math in her head, computing loss, trying to figure out how to reverse this. She told me I couldn't be serious, that I was upset and not thinking clearly, that people didn't actually disinherit their children over one mistake. She said I was 73 years old and maybe I should talk to my doctor about whether my medications might be affecting my judgment. There it was, the card I'd been waiting for her to play. The suggestion that my age, my widowhood, my cardiac condition, my grief over Thomas something, anything had made me mentally incompetent to make this decision. She was already constructing the narrative she'd tell friends, tell Jake, maybe even tell a lawyer. Poor mom. She's not herself. She's not thinking straight. Someone needs to protect her from her own confused choices. I'd seen this pattern before. In my accounting practice, I'd handled 3 cases of financial elder abuse. Always the same story. Adult children convincing themselves that their elderly parents weren't competent, that taking control of assets was actually protective, that circumventing the older person's wishes was justified by age and presumed diminished capacity. I stood up slowly, using the desk for support not because I needed it, but because I wanted Amanda to see me as I was, 73 years old, post-cardiac event, widow, the perfect victim for the narrative she was already writing in her mind. Then I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out another folder. Inside was documentation of every financial decision I'd made in the past 3 years since Thomas died. Tax returns, reviewed and filed flawlessly. Investment decisions, all profitable or strategically sound. Estate planning documents, properly executed. Medical records showing stable health, controlled blood pressure, normal cognitive function from my annual physical just 2 months ago. I spread these documents on the desk in front of Amanda and told her something in the calmest voice I could manage. I was 73 years old, not senile. I'd managed multi-million-dollar accounts until retirement. I'd built a business from nothing. I'd survived losing my husband, recovering from a cardiac event, and navigating the complex grief of widowhood. My mind was sharp, my judgment was sound, and my decision about my estate was final. Amanda's face went through several transformations: shock, anger, fear, then something that looked almost like respect, as if she was seeing me as a person rather than just her mother for the first time in years. She asked me what she could do to fix this, how she could prove she understood, prove she'd changed, whether there was any way to make this right. I sat back down and told her the truth. I didn't know if she could fix it. Trust wasn't a contract you could simply renegotiate. Respect wasn't something you could perform your way back into. She'd shown me who she was when she thought I wouldn't find out. That was the truth I had to work with. But I also told her I wasn't signing the new will immediately. David Chen wouldn't have it ready for my signature until Friday, 2 days away. I'd give her that time to think about what she actually valued and why. Not to convince me, not to perform remorse, but to actually sit with what she'd done and understand it. Amanda left my office 20 minutes later, walking slowly to her car, like someone who'd just received devastating medical news. I watched from my window as she sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. Part of me hoped she was having an epiphany. Part of me knew she was probably just trying to figure out damage control. That evening, my phone rang. Jake, Amanda's boyfriend. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He told me Amanda was devastated, that she'd explained everything to him, that they'd decided to cancel the Paris trip entirely. He said Amanda was a good person who'd made one bad choice, and didn't everyone deserve a second chance. His voice had that practiced sincerity of someone in sales, someone who knew how to pitch an idea. I asked him one question. When Amanda told him about taking the ring to the jeweler, how had he responded? The silence on the other end told me everything. He hadn't objected, hadn't questioned it, hadn't suggested maybe she should ask her mother first. He'd probably been excited about the vacation money, already planning which 5-star restaurant they'd try first. I told him I appreciated his call and ended the conversation. Then I turned off my phone and sat in the quiet of my house, the house I'd lived in for 44 years, where I'd raised Amanda, where Thomas and I had built our life. The ring sat in its box on my desk, glinting in the lamplight. My mother's ring. My ring now. Amanda's ring never, unless she earned back something that couldn't be measured in dollars. 2 days until I signed the papers. 2 days for my daughter to prove whether she was capable of understanding value over price. I wasn't optimistic, but I'd been wrong before. Sometimes people surprise you. Then again, sometimes they don't. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of November weather that makes you grateful for warm houses and hot coffee. I woke at 6, same as I'd done for 50 years of working life. Old habits persist, even in retirement. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all from Amanda. I scrolled through them while drinking my coffee. The messages started apologetic around midnight, grew more desperate by 3 a.m., then shifted to something else entirely by dawn. The latest message, sent at 5:47 a.m., asked if we could meet for breakfast to discuss everything rationally. She suggested her favorite cafe, the expensive one downtown where brunch cost $40 per person. Even in crisis, Amanda's instinct was toward luxury. I didn't respond. Instead, I called David Chen at his office. He answered on the second ring. Lawyers who handle estates learn to start work early, before grief and family drama fully wake up. I asked him about the finalized will. He confirmed it would be ready for signature the next day, Friday afternoon. He also mentioned he'd included additional protective measures, a clause specifically stating my sound mind and deliberate intention, medical documentation of my cognitive capacity, and detailed explanation of my reasoning. These additions would make it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge the will on grounds of incompetence or undue influence. Then David asked me a question I appreciated. Was I certain this was what I wanted? Or was I making decisions while hurt and angry that I might regret later? I told him about Amanda's text messages, about Jake's phone call the night before, about how my daughter's concerns seemed focused entirely on restoring her inheritance rather than understanding her actions. David listened quietly, then said something that crystallized everything. In his 30 years of estate law, he'd learned that how people respond to financial consequences reveals their true character. The ones who take responsibility and rebuild trust without demanding forgiveness are rare. Most just get better at manipulation. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Amanda had done homework as a child, where Thomas and I had shared countless meals, and made myself face an uncomfortable truth. I'd been a generous mother, maybe too generous. Every financial struggle Amanda faced, I'd solved. Down payment for her apartment, car trouble, credit card debt from her 20s. I'd always stepped in because I could, because I loved her, because watching your child struggle hurts worse than any personal hardship. But generosity without boundaries doesn't build character. It builds entitlement. My doorbell rang at 9:30 a.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Amanda standing on my porch, holding a large shopping bag and flowers. She'd clearly been crying, her eyes swollen, makeup smudged. She looked genuinely devastated, and my maternal instinct kicked in immediately, that deep biological urge to comfort my child in distress. I opened the door, but didn't invite her inside. She thrust the flowers toward me, expensive roses, the kind Thomas used to buy for our anniversary. She started talking rapidly, words tumbling over each other. She'd brought breakfast from the bakery we used to visit together when she was little. She'd written me a letter explaining everything. She'd already called 3 different refugee organizations to ask about volunteer opportunities. She wanted to show me she understood, that she was committed to making this right. I took the flowers, but told her I needed more time. She asked how much time, her voice rising with panic. I said I didn't know. Then I gently closed the door. Through the peephole, I watched her stand on my porch for several minutes, shoulders shaking. Finally, she set the bakery bag on my doorstep and walked back to her car. She sat there for a long time before driving away. I felt terrible. What mother wants to watch her child suffer? But I also felt resolute. Suffering without transformation is just drama. Only time would tell which Amanda was experiencing. I brought the bakery bag inside. She'd bought all my favorites: almond croissants, apple turnovers, the chocolate babka I'd loved since childhood. Either she'd remembered my preferences, or she'd called my regular bakery and asked what I usually ordered. Either way, it showed effort. That afternoon, I did something I should have done years ago. I went through every financial transaction I'd made for Amanda over the past decade. Bank statements, checks, payments I'd covered. My accountant training made me meticulous about record keeping, even personal expenses. The total shocked me. Over 10 years, I'd given Amanda roughly $180,000, not all at once, but steadily. $5,000 here for a car repair, $12,000 there for apartment costs, $25,000 for her MBA program that she'd started then quit after one semester. Smaller amounts, constantly dinner money, vacation contributions, insurance payments when she was between jobs. I'd never added it up before, never wanted to, probably. My daughter had received more financial support over 10 years than most people earned in total, and her response to this generosity was attempting to convert my mother's ring into vacation money. That evening, I received an email from Amanda. The subject line read, "Everything I should have said." The email was long, several pages in. I could tell she'd worked on it carefully. She wrote about growing up feeling pressure to be successful, about how she'd always seen me as this perfectly capable woman who built a business and managed everything effortlessly. She said, watching me handle everything alone after Dad died made her realize how strong I was, but also made her feel inadequate by comparison. She wrote about Jake, admitting for the first time that he was more focused on money and status than she'd wanted to acknowledge. She said taking the ring had been his idea originally, but that she'd agreed because part of her wanted to prove she could be spontaneous and carefree instead of always careful and responsible like me. The email ended with a promise: she would earn back my trust however long it took. She understood if I never wanted to alter the will, but she hoped I'd at least give her a chance to demonstrate she could be better. I read the email 3 times. Parts rang true. The pressure, the comparisons, the complicated feelings children have about successful parents, but other parts felt calculated, like she was trying every possible angle to find what might work. I didn't respond, not yet. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months, Linda Morrison, the jeweler's wife. Linda and I had been in the same book club for 20 years, though I'd stopped attending after Thomas died. Linda answered warmly, clearly pleased to hear from me. After catching up briefly, I asked her a delicate question. When Amanda had brought the ring to the store, had Linda been there? Had she noticed anything about my daughter's demeanor? Linda hesitated, then told me something her husband hadn't mentioned. Amanda had come to the store with Jake. They'd been laughing, excited, already planning their Paris trip out loud. Jake had looked at other jewelry in the cases while Amanda handled the consignment paperwork. Asking Linda about expensive watches, Amanda had referred to the ring as my inheritance, just a little early, and had laughed when she said it. My stomach turned. The cavalier attitude, the assumption that my possessions were already hers, the complete lack of gravity about what she was doing. Linda apologized for telling me this, said she wasn't sure if I needed to know, but thought context mattered. I thanked Linda and ended the call. Then I sat with this new information, feeling the last remnants of doubt evaporate. Amanda's tearful apologies and carefully crafted email existed in a different universe from her behavior at that jewelry counter. People can perform remorse beautifully while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Tomorrow I would sign papers that reflected reality, not performance. Friday arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of bright November morning that feels like a gift. I dressed in the same navy suit I'd worn for important business meetings throughout my career. If I was going to sign away most of my estate from my only child, I'd do it with the same professional composure I'd brought to every major decision in my life. David Chen arrived at my house at 10 a.m., briefcase in hand, accompanied by 2 witnesses he'd brought from his office, a legal requirement for estate documents. I'd made coffee and set out the good china, because even difficult moments deserve dignity. We sat at my dining room table, the same table where Thomas and I had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 30 years, where Amanda had blown out birthday candles from age 1 to 18. David spread out the documents with practiced efficiency, pointing out each section, each clause, each protection he'd built into the language. The will was ironclad. 80% of my estate, approximately $1.5 million, would be distributed among 4 organizations: the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the International Rescue Committee, a local refugee resettlement program, and a scholarship fund for first-generation immigrants pursuing accounting degrees. The remaining 20% would go to Amanda, along with specific personal items: my mother's journal, family photographs, and a letter I'd written explaining my decision. David asked one final time if I was certain. I picked up the pen, a fountain pen Thomas had given me when I earned my CPA certification in 1975, and signed my name on each page. The witnesses signed. David notarized everything. It took 15 minutes to fundamentally restructure my daughter's future. After David and his witnesses left, I sat alone in my dining room feeling strangely calm, not happy, not vindictive, just resolved. I'd made a decision based on character revealed, not character hoped for. That's what 50 years of financial analysis had taught me. Trust the data, not the story people tell about the data. My phone rang. Amanda. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Her voice was small, fragile, in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. She asked if she could come over, said she needed to tell me something important, something she should have said days ago. I told her she could come at 2 p.m. She arrived early, at 1:45, wearing jeans and an old sweater I recognized from high school. No makeup, hair pulled back simply. She looked young and scared, and nothing like the polished marketing executive who'd walked into a jewelry store planning to sell her grandmother's survival story. We sat in my living room, neutral territory. Not the formal office where I'd confronted her, not the cozy kitchen where we used to chat like friends. She twisted her hands in her lap, a nervous gesture she'd had since childhood. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. She'd broken up with Jake, not because of the inheritance situation, though that had certainly accelerated things, but because of something he'd said 2 nights ago when she'd told him about my decision to restructure the will. Jake had suggested she could contest it. He'd said, at 73, after a cardiac event, after losing Thomas, I probably wasn't thinking clearly. He'd mentioned terms like undue influence and diminished capacity, and had even looked up elder law attorneys. He'd framed it as protecting me from making decisions I'd regret, protecting our family assets from being wasted on strangers. Amanda said, listening to Jake talk about me that way, calculating, dismissive, viewing my age and widowhood as weaknesses to exploit, made her realize she'd been thinking similarly. Maybe not as blatantly, but the underlying attitude was the same. She'd taken the ring because she'd stopped seeing me as a complete person and started seeing me as an obstacle between her and eventual inheritance. She started crying then, not the theatrical tears of someone performing remorse, but the ugly, genuine crying of someone confronting their own ugliness. She told me she'd spent the past 3 days reviewing every financial record she could find. Every time I'd helped her, every crisis I'd solved with money she'd never paid back, she'd calculated it the same way. I had around $180,000 over 10 years. She said she'd been treating me like a bank that never expected repayment, like resources existed solely for her convenience. She'd stopped asking about my life, my health, my loneliness after Dad died. When was the last time she'd invited me to dinner without wanting something? When was the last time she'd called, just to talk? I sat, very still, listening, trying to assess whether this was manipulation or genuine breakthrough. 50 years of reading people across desks taught me to look for specific tells. Was she making eye contact? Yes. Was her body language open or defensive? Open. Was she making excuses or taking responsibility? The latter. But the real test came next. Amanda pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to me. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a payment plan she'd drafted. She wanted to start repaying the $180,000 I'd given her over the years. Not because she thought it would restore her inheritance, she understood that decision was made, but because the debt was real, whether or not I'd explicitly called it a loan. The payment plan was detailed, realistic, based on her actual salary and expenses. $5,000 now, then monthly payments of $1,500 for the next 10 years. She'd calculated the timeline herself, accounting for interest at a fair rate. She said she knew it wouldn't fix anything, wouldn't undo taking the ring, wouldn't restore trust immediately, but it was a start at becoming someone who understood value instead of just price. I looked at this check, this payment plan written in my daughter's handwriting, and felt something shift. Not forgiveness that would take time, but possibility. The possibility that people could recognize their own ugliness and choose differently. I told Amanda I'd accept her payments, but on one condition. Half the money would go into a dedicated fund that she'd eventually donate to refugee organizations in her grandmother's name. Not my name, Rose Kaminsky's name. She needed to build her own relationship with the legacy she'd almost sold. Amanda nodded immediately, pulled out her phone, and started making notes about the fund structure, asking questions about which organizations, how to set it up properly, whether she could volunteer as well as donate. The shift from passive recipient to active participant was visible, tangible. I still didn't know if this transformation would last. Character forged in crisis sometimes reverts when the crisis passes. But I knew something else. I'd made the right decision with the will, not as punishment, but as reality. Amanda had $380,000 coming to her eventually, plus whatever she built herself. That was more than most people started with, and maybe exactly what she needed to become, someone who earned rather than expected. As Amanda left that afternoon, she hugged me at the door, the first genuine embrace we'd shared since this began. She whispered that she loved me, and was sorry, that she'd prove she could be better, even if it took years. I watched her drive away, and felt something I hadn't felt in days. Hope, not certainty, but hope. Sometimes that's enough. The will was signed, the inheritance restructured, but maybe, just maybe, I'd given my daughter something more valuable than money, the chance to discover who she actually wanted to be. The weekend passed quietly. Amanda texted me Saturday morning to confirm she'd opened a dedicated savings account for the repayment plan and had already deposited her first check. She sent me a screenshot of the account, $5,000 sitting there with my name listed as a beneficiary for transparency. Small gesture, but it showed follow-through. Sunday afternoon, she called to ask if she could take me to dinner. Not somewhere expensive. She specifically suggested a small Italian restaurant we used to visit when she was in college. The kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and family recipes that hadn't changed in 40 years. I agreed. Dinner was awkward at first, both of us navigating this new territory between us. Not mother and child anymore, not quite equals, but something undefined. We talked about safe topics: her work, the weather, a book I was reading. Then, over tiramisu, we'd agreed to split. Amanda asked me about my mother, in a way she never had before. She wanted to know what Rose was like as a person, not just as a Holocaust survivor. What made her laugh? What annoyed her? What were her daily routines, her small joys, her personality beyond the trauma narrative? I found myself telling stories I hadn't thought about in years. How my mother sang Polish folk songs while cooking, slightly off-key but enthusiastic. How she saved every button from worn-out clothes, kept them in a glass jar, sorted by color. How she'd learned English by watching soap operas, and consequently spoke with oddly dramatic flair. How she'd made me practice piano for an hour every day because, in America, children have opportunities and she wasn't going to let me waste them. Amanda listened intently, taking notes on her phone. She said she wanted to write down these stories, create a proper family history document, maybe even research our family tree back in Poland. She asked if I still had any of my mother's belongings beyond the ring and the journal. This conversation felt different from the performative remorse earlier in the week. This felt like genuine curiosity, like Amanda was trying to understand the woman whose legacy she'd almost traded for a vacation. I couldn't tell if it would last, but it was something. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jake appeared at my door at 8:30 a.m., dressed in an expensive suit, holding a folder. I almost didn't let him in, but curiosity won. He sat in my living room uninvited and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. He told me he'd been thinking about the situation, that he understood my concerns, that maybe there was a compromise we could reach. He opened his folder and pulled out printed documents, articles about estate planning, information about setting up trusts, suggestions for protecting family assets while ensuring charitable intentions are honored. He spoke in smooth, professional tones about how emotional decisions made in the heat of conflict often led to regret. He suggested I could establish a trust that would give Amanda access to funds, gradually while still donating to my chosen charities. He had specific numbers, specific structures, all carefully calculated to sound reasonable, while fundamentally undermining my decision. I let him finish his entire presentation. Then I asked him one question. Did Amanda know he was here? His hesitation told me everything. He admitted she didn't, said he'd wanted to approach me privately, said sometimes people in conflict needed outside mediation. He positioned himself as the rational third party trying to help a family in crisis. I stood up and told him to leave. He started to protest, began another speech about how he was only trying to help, how Amanda was devastated, how families shouldn't let money destroy relationships. I walked to my front door and opened it. Jake's expression shifted then, the smooth professionalism cracking. He told me I was making a mistake, that Amanda deserved better than this, that I was being cruel and vindictive. He said old people got bitter and took it out on their children, and that's exactly what I was doing. I looked at this man who'd encouraged my daughter to steal from me, who was now trying to manipulate me directly, and felt grateful. Grateful that Amanda had ended things with him. Grateful that his presence here confirmed every decision I'd made. I told him that in 50 years of business, I'd met many people who mistook someone's politeness for weakness, who thought age meant gullibility. I said he'd made that mistake with me, encouraged Amanda to make that mistake, and now he was watching opportunities slip away because neither of you had bothered to actually know me. Jake left without another word, his folder tucked under his arm, his careful presentation wasted. I watched him drive away in his expensive car and felt nothing but relief. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Amanda, her voice panicked and furious. She'd apparently gotten a text from Jake bragging about his productive conversation with me. She was mortified, kept apologizing, swore she hadn't known, hadn't approved, would never have wanted him to approach me that way. I believed her. The Amanda who'd tried to sell the ring might have coordinated with Jake on this scheme. The Amanda who'd spent the weekend researching her grandmother's history and setting up repayment accounts wouldn't have. I told her what Jake had said, his suggestions about trusts and compromises, his comments about bitter old people. Amanda was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised me. She told me she was glad I'd seen who Jake really was, because it helped her see him clearly too. She'd been wondering if she'd made a mistake breaking up with him. Now she knew she hadn't. We talked for over an hour. About Jake, about judgment, about how we both needed to get better at seeing people as they actually were instead of as we hoped they'd be. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. By the time we hung up, I realized something important. The will restructuring wasn't punishment, it was clarity. It had forced both of us to see our relationship honestly, stripped of assumptions and expectations. Whether Amanda could sustain this growth remained uncertain. But at least we were finally working with truth, instead of comfortable illusions. 3 weeks passed. Amanda made her first scheduled payment, $1,500 transferred electronically with a note. Payment 1 of $120, half to refugee fund as agreed. She'd set up automatic transfers, which meant this wasn't just initial enthusiasm. She was building systems for long-term commitment. We'd started having dinner together once a week. Nothing fancy. Usually at my house where I'd cook simple meals, roast chicken, vegetables, the Polish dishes my mother had taught me. Amanda would arrive early to help prep, and we'd talk while chopping onions or stirring soup. These quiet domestic moments felt like rebuilding something fundamental that had been missing. She'd also started volunteering at a refugee resettlement center downtown, helping newcomers navigate paperwork and benefits applications. She called me after her first shift, excited and overwhelmed. She'd helped a Syrian family understand their lease agreement, translated financial documents with help from an interpreter, spent 3 hours on bureaucracy that would have taken her 20 minutes in her normal life. She said she kept thinking about Grandma Rose arriving in America at 19 with nothing, trying to understand systems in a language she barely spoke, dealing with officials who saw her as just another displaced person. Amanda told me she'd never really understood what that meant until she watched modern refugees face the same confusion and fear. I didn't tell her then, but hearing that shift in her perspective made me reconsider something I'd been wrestling with since signing the will. Not the decision itself that stood, but perhaps there was room for evolution if Amanda continued demonstrating genuine transformation over time. Then came the phone call that tested everything. It was a Tuesday evening in early December. I was reading in my living room when my phone rang a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end identified herself as Patricia Brennan, calling from Dublin, Ireland. She said she was my husband's niece, though Thomas had never mentioned any Irish relatives to me. My first instinct was scam-elderly widow, perfect target for inheritance fraud. But Patricia had details. She knew Thomas's parents' names, knew he'd grown up in Boston, knew about his career in finance consulting. She said her father was Thomas's older brother who'd moved to Ireland in the 1960s and lost touch with the American side of the family. Her father had recently passed away, and while going through his papers she'd found old letters and photographs that mentioned Thomas. She'd searched online and found Thomas's obituary from 2021. Then, she'd tracked me down through public records, hoping to connect with her American family, even if most of them were gone. She asked if we could talk sometime, said she'd love to hear stories about Thomas's life, share stories about his brother's life in Ireland. I was cautious, but intrigued. I asked her to email me copies of the documents she'd mentioned, the letters, the photographs. She agreed immediately and sent them within an hour. The documents looked authentic. Photographs from the 1950s, showing two young men who clearly shared features. One was definitely a young Thomas. Letters discussing family matters, signed with names I recognized from Thomas's rare mentions of his childhood. If this was a scam, it was extraordinarily elaborate. I called Amanda and told her about the contact. Her first reaction was skepticism. She'd seen enough online fraud attempts in her marketing work to be wary. But when I forwarded her the documents, she went quiet. Then she said something that showed how much she'd been learning at the refugee center. She told me she'd met with volunteers who specialized in helping refugees reconnect with family members scattered across continents. She'd learned about the databases, the search methods, the emotional complexity of finding relatives decades after separation. She offered to help me verify Patricia's claims using some of these resources. Over the next week, Amanda threw herself into investigation. She contacted genealogy services, cross-referenced records, even found a volunteer at the refugee center who had connections to genealogy researchers in Ireland. Every evening she'd call with updates, verification of birth records, confirmation of her grandfather's brother's emigration in 1962, documentation that aligned with Patricia's story. Finally, she arranged a video call for the three of us, me, Amanda, and Patricia, in Dublin. Seeing Patricia's face on screen was startling. She had Thomas's smile, his mannerisms, even his habit of rubbing his chin when thinking. We talked for 2 hours, sharing stories, comparing family histories, laughing and crying over connections that had been lost for 60 years. After the call ended, Amanda and I sat in my living room in silence for a while. Then she said something that surprised me. She told me she'd been thinking about my will decision differently lately. She'd initially seen it as punishment, then as justified consequence, but now she understood it as something else entirely, as liberation. She explained that knowing she'd inherit everything had created a strange passivity in her life. She'd made career decisions assuming financial backup would always exist. She'd spent money carelessly because more would eventually come. She'd treated relationships, including ours, as permanent and unconditional regardless of her behavior. The restructured will had forced her to build her own life instead of waiting to inherit one. I asked her if she was saying this hoping I'd restructure the will again. She laughed and told me absolutely not. She said if I gave her back the full inheritance now, it would undermine everything she'd learned. She needed the next 10 years of payments, the volunteer work, the process of earning back trust through sustained action rather than promises. Then she said something that made me reconsider everything. She told me she'd been thinking about her own future will. When she eventually had assets to leave behind, she wanted to structure it the way I had, not all 2 children or family, but distributed to causes that mattered, creating legacy beyond bloodline. That's when I realized my decision hadn't just protected my mother's legacy, it had taught my daughter how to create her own. We spent the rest of the evening planning a trip to Ireland to meet Patricia in person. Amanda insisted on paying for my ticket with her own savings, not the money I'd given her over the years, not the future inheritance, but money she'd earned herself. It was a small gesture that meant everything. 6 months have passed since that phone call from Morrison & Sons. 6 months since my daughter tried to sell my mother's ring for a Paris vacation. 6 months since I restructured my will and watched Amanda's world collapse, and then slowly, carefully, rebuild itself. The legal consequences were straightforward. The will remains as I signed 80% to organizations supporting refugees and Holocaust remembrance. 20% to Amanda. David Chen keeps the documents in his office safe, properly executed and legally unassailable. That decision stands, and both Amanda and I have made peace with it. But the personal consequences have been more complex and, surprisingly, more hopeful than I anticipated. Amanda has made 6 monthly payments now, totaling $9,000 plus her initial $5,000. Half goes into the refugee fund we established in Rose Kaminsky's name, half toward repaying the $180,000 I'd given her over the years. At this rate, she finished paying me back when she's 47 years old. She have spent 12 years making monthly payments, 12 years living with the tangible weight of obligation and responsibility. More significantly, she's continued volunteering at the Refugee Resettlement Center, not just showing up, but becoming genuinely involved. She's helped 17 families navigate housing applications, benefits, paperwork, job searches. She's used her marketing expertise to help the organization improve their donor outreach, raising an additional $40,000 in funding. Last month, they asked her to join their board of directors. She called me crying with pride when she accepted. The relationship between us has transformed into something I never expected. We're not just mother and daughter anymore. We're two adults who've seen each other at our worst and chosen to build something better from the wreckage. We have dinner together weekly, but now she often cooks for me, insisting I should let her take care of me for once. We talk honestly about things we used to avoid: money, expectations, the burden of being an only child to demanding parents. She's also taken on the project of documenting our family history. She's researched our Polish roots, contacted archives in Warsaw, built a family tree that goes back 5 generations. She's written detailed accounts of every story I've told her about my mother, recording them carefully so they won't be lost. She's even learning Polish through an app, slowly and imperfectly, but with genuine commitment. Jake disappeared from our lives completely. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to California for a job opportunity. Amanda mentioned once that she'd dodged a bullet, that seeing him try to manipulate me had shown her a future she didn't want. She's been single since then, focusing on work and volunteering and rebuilding herself. She says she's not ready to date anyone until she's sure she's become someone worth dating. The Irish connection with Patricia Brennan has blossomed beautifully. We visited Dublin in March. Amanda paid for my ticket as promised, used her vacation days, booked a modest bed and breakfast instead of luxury hotels. We spent a week with Patricia and her family, visiting the town where Thomas's brother had lived. Seeing photographs and documents that filled in decades of family history Thomas never knew. Patricia has become a regular presence in our lives through video calls and emails. She's planning to visit us next summer, bringing her adult children who are excited to meet their American cousins. Family has expanded in unexpected directions, proving that connection isn't always about inheritance and obligation. Sometimes it's just about choosing to show up for each other. The ring itself sits in a new location now. Not hidden in my safe, but displayed in a custom case on my mantel, right next to a photograph of my mother taken in 1952, just after she became an American citizen. Every morning, I see it there, catching the light, reminding me of survival and choice and the difference between price and value. I've made my own changes too. I've started attending Linda Morrison's book club again, reconnecting with friends I'd isolated from after Thomas died. I've taken up watercolor painting, something I always wanted to try but never made time for. I've traveled to Boston to visit Thomas's childhood neighborhood, then to the small town in New Hampshire where we'd honeymooned in 1973. I'm 73 years old, living with a cardiac condition that requires medication and monitoring, navigating widowhood and age and all the vulnerabilities that come with both. But I'm also living deliberately, making choices based on what matters rather than what's expected, protecting what I value while remaining open to growth and surprise. My estate plan remains unchanged, but I've told Amanda that if she continues on her current path of payments, the volunteer work, the genuine transformation I've witnessed, I'll consider adding a codicil after 5 years, not to restore the full inheritance, but perhaps to increase her portion slightly, to acknowledge sustained commitment rather than temporary performance. She told me she doesn't want me thinking about that, doesn't want the next 5 years to be another test she's trying to pass. She said she's doing this work because it's who she wants to be, not because of what she might gain. If that's true, and I believe it is, then she's already inherited something more valuable than money. People ask me if I regret my decision, if disinheriting most of my estate from my only child was too harsh. I tell them it wasn't disinheritance, it was clarity. It was teaching my daughter that legacy isn't just about passing down wealth, it's about passing down values, wisdom, the understanding that what we choose to honor with our resources defines who we are. My mother fled Poland with a ring sewn into her coat. I'm leaving behind organizations that will help hundreds of refugees rebuild their lives. Amanda is learning to build her own legacy through action rather than inheritance. 3 generations, 3 different forms of survival. all connected by the same lesson. What matters isn't what you're given, but what you choose to become. I wear my mother's ring every day now. When I look at it, I don't just see a diamond that survived the Holocaust. I see proof that courage and clarity and difficult choices can transform not just one life, but generations of lives that follow. That's the inheritance that actually matters. And unlike money, it can't be stolen, can't be sold, can't be squandered. It can only be earned, lived, and passed forward through example. Amanda understands that now. It took losing $1.5 million to learn it, but some lessons are worth exactly that price. So tell me, where are you watching this from? Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect what matters most? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories about families, legacy, and the complicated choices we make for the people we love. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save us.